I'm your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of three daughters. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 56 of the Future Template Parent Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Carolyn Solo, PhD, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of three daughters, 7 and under. I hope you all listened to last week's episode in which I interviewed the amazing Maureen and Christina, who are LMFTs and couples intensive therapists in Fairfax, Virginia. And they also have some resources for therapists. So go back and listen to that if you haven't already, because it was just like chock full of amazing info. And I'm just so in awe of what they're doing. And it's such a needed service. And they're doing a great job educating therapists about how to do that work as well. So this week is a slightly kind of different style episode. I am including a segment of a coaching call I did last week with a therapist named Natalie. We had a great time chatting about intensive, answering some of her questions. So the segment of our interview that I am including of our coaching session is really about kind of two things, or a few things, like treatment planning and intensive. How do you sort of pitch an intensive to a current client or even a new client? And then who do you rule in and rule out for intensives? So hopefully you'll find that interesting. And one of the reasons I wanted to include this as an episode is that I am in the midst of enrolling people in my group program for this fall, starting the first week of September. Have some people in the group already. I'm super excited about who's going to be in. I'm capping the group at 8, so it's going to be a nice and intimate group with a lot of sort of high touch contact. There are 6 modules that are 2 weeks long. There's a video lesson. Actually, there's a bunch of mini lessons in each module, some homework assignments for implementation. And then every 2 weeks, as part of that module, we have a 2 hour. Originally, it was 90 minutes, but I decided to increase it to 2 hours, give everyone plenty of time. 2 hour group coaching call in which all your questions get answered. I can give you kind of like, really focused feedback on the implementation exercises you're doing to make sure that you're actually getting the transformation that you need from this program. The modules cover like money mindset, what's your why, setting fees, changing the structure of your practice, actually structuring an intensive, marketing your intensive, getting referral, writing your web copy, social media, all the clinical tools I use in my instruction on how to use them, my client workbook, all of the scripts, cheat sheet, my like clinical tools, cheat sheets that I use, my workbook, all my, paperwork, that's all included as well. You get like a Google Drive library of all the stuff that I use. And we also have like a forum hosted on Circle. But everything will be on the Circle platform, and there'll be like a message board where you can post questions in between sessions, and we can all sort of respond and support you. And there is also going to be Slack support for sort of more like one-to-one questions with me. I will look at all your content that you want me to. I will make my edits. I will give you feedback. So yeah, just a brief overview of the program. I'm going to put the link in the show notes for the actual sales page, so you can go there and get all the info. It's a very detailed sales page. So just a little bit about that. But in any case, I hope you enjoy this brief coaching episode with Natalie. I think you'll get some tips, and it'll give you kind of an insight into what it's like to work with me. So I will talk to you all next week. Have a great week and enjoy this insider view into a coaching session with me.
Oh, definitely, like, my clients that are the children of, like, emotionally immature parents, like,
Okay.
my attachment-focused clients, my emotional, challenge like, my clients that have had emotionally, like, abusive or immature or really challenging childhoods, like, that's my niche.
Yeah.
I also do a lot of grief and loss work, which has been absolutely beautiful with
Mhm.
Ian.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I could see with both of those how you could make a really good argument for a short term condensed amount of work, right? So if you think about the children of emotionally, children who experience emotional abuse or neglect, right? I think with an intensive, I think the best thing to do is you always want to think of it as at least when you first start the intensive work, like over time, if you work with someone intensively, like over several months, it'll look different eventually. But at the beginning, you want to think like, what's the overarching theme that we're gonna hang the whole intensive on, right? Because it intensive is intentionally more boundaried than, full EMDR, like EMD big R, right? It's almost like you're doing a little bit of, it's kind of like EMD little r is how I like to think of an intensive. So you do want to have some sort of coherent thing that you're focusing on. So it could be with a child that suffered emotional abuse. Are you picking a very specific experience that you're going to focus on? Maybe like, I'm just thinking of one of my own clients. There was a time where her mom left her at the mall and didn't like realize for hours that she didn't, I mean, whatever. That seems impossible to imagine, but the mother had a lot of stuff going on with addiction and whatever. But like she left her child at the mall and this is my client when she was like 10, and my client had to find her way back home. Like no one came to get her. And that is just such an emblematic experience for her of what her childhood looked like, that you're doing intensive around that particular experience. Because obviously that has roots in so many other things, but it's going to give you that sort of map so you can do the treatment planning in a really condensed way. And I always use something called, I don't know, I mean, every basic training talks about it, but they use different terms. RTEP, the recent traumatic event protocol. Did you guys talk about that in your basic training? Sometimes they do like a little, like 2-minute thing.
Yeah.
But basically it's a protocol where that is what it sounds like. You're focusing on a specific traumatic event. And they say it's called the recent traumatic event protocol, but I've talked about this. If you listen, I have a whole podcast episode about this. It really is any event that happened to them that's still affecting them in the present. So basically, it can be literally anything. But what it is it just provides a really nice roadmap for how to treatment plan the intensive. Because basically what you have them do in a very brief nutshell, and I have like a little one pager about this that I can send you that just tells you the steps. But basically what it is you have them like, first thing you have them do, or at least I have them do, people do it differently, is like I have them hold the buzzers or watch the light bar, whichever one they prefer. And I just have them narrate what I say at the 10,000-foot view. So we're not going through every single detail of what happened, but like narrate that event from when it started to how it's affecting you in the present. Spend like 5 minutes doing that. And so they do that while they're holding the buzzers or using the light bar. And that provides it actually does help them start to process because they have to kind of give it some sort of linearity. First thing you do. And then I say, okay, and while they're doing that, I'm kind of making notes myself of what I think targets could be within that. Okay. To help myself. I mean, it may or may not be totally accurate, but it kind of helps me track the process, and then what I say is, okay, now I'm going to have you do what I call a Google search. Well, that's what they say in the intro. You can call it whatever you want, but like, I want you to now that we've talked, I want you to just scan the event in your mind and tell me what point you like stop on first. And what they call that in our talk, call that a point of disturbance. Because you process each point of disturbance as if it's its own target. So they pick the point of disturbance. They're like, oh, the first thing that comes up for me is that moment when I turned around and she wasn't there. Or I'm just using. And so we set that up like a regular target, process that as if it were a regular target. And then once you get that one down to a 0-7 clear or as close as you can, I feel like this is a bigger issue, but a bigger topic, but you have to be judicious in an intensive. You might not always get all the way to a 0-7 clear right away, but you might just decide to move on anyway if you feel like, okay, for now we're good. Okay. And then I say, okay, now scan it again. What's the next point of disturbance? Okay. And just keep doing that. And what often happens is that the points of disturbance are obviously connected. So once they've done a few of them, some of the later ones might not feel as intense. It's like any kind of target, right? Like when you do some of the connected things, some of them won't feel as bad as maybe they thought they were at the beginning. Sure. And so basically you get through all the points of disturbance and then you have them scan the entire event for any remaining disturbance. And if there is any, you process that. But eventually at the end, you're saying, can you get to a 0-7 clear for the entire experience? Does that make sense? That's like a very brief overview of it, but that's the idea.
Yeah, like, I mean, so I guess, like, essentially it is like EMD small r, but you're taking, like, the memory fragments,
Yeah.
like, that's how we kind of explain them in our basic training, and then you're trying to clear them, um, but it's part of, like, that overarching
Yeah.
memory of the "I got left at the mall,"
Right.
but it's also, like, you're working with, like, the felt sense of abandonment, like,
Yeah.
you're working with the fact that, like, my mom wasn't there when, like, when I needed her,
Like
I have to now get home and I don't know how to get home. There's fear, there's
when I'm under
anxiety.
10, I shouldn't have to do this. Like, right, exactly. Yeah. So there's all these different pieces to it, which just as you were saying, you can see, like, obviously for someone who had that one experience, so many of those moments will have popped up in other ways in their life, right? So doing this intensive can be really valuable in reducing some, like making some new, getting some new insights, making some new connections that maybe they weren't, you know, getting to before. But of course,
Mhm,
it's not going to resolve everything. And that's not the point of it. But it's like, let's make a really good chunk of progress on this memory that's really, really, really hard.
mhm.
And then let's assess and see where we are, you know?
Okay.
And I think something you always want to keep in mind, of course, you're going to have to probably contain other things that come up during the process. If she, if this person kept going back to a much, much earlier memory, I would say something like, I see that this is really, really important, really significant. Like, I want to make sure we don't forget about that. Let's make a note of it. Let's contain it. Let's like make sure that that's the next thing we get to at like once we work through this, because I
Mhm,
like to show people when we're doing intensives that like we're choosing a specific reason. I want you to come in for a specific reason, and I want us to attend to that specific reason. Like, partly because that's what I'm promising an intensive will do. And so I want to like live
yeah,
up to my part of it. And like they're expecting us to create and sustain that frame, right? So it is actually really important, I think, in an intensive not to let things go all over the place. Um, I feel like when you have a weekly client, that can happen more because you're just like, well, I'm going to see him again next week. So wherever we go is great. I do think it's really, really valuable in an intensive. You need to recognize this is intentionally short term, even if I keep working with.
okay.
But like, just imagine how somebody like that could gain so much from that experience.
Mhm,
Maybe have some really profound new insights about like beliefs about themselves, their comprehension of their relationship with their parent, their like
mhm,
felt sense of like security, right? A lot can happen in the I do like a 15-hour structure, but you can do it however you want. Like a lot
oh,
can happen in that time that can like put them so much further ahead, right? So I'd say the
mm,
first thing is you want to, for whichever client you want to sort of pitch this to, have an idea of like what would be the pitch that you make. Right. So that was kind of my example. I would tell this person, hey, I have an idea. What if we did this about this particular moment, that time you got left at the mall? And here's why I think that could be really effective. Here's why I think having longer time to do it could be really important. Here's why I think focusing on that particular experience would be really valuable. I feel like we're getting stuck there. We're kind of circling around it over and over again. Like, so I use a particular focus to pitch it, if that makes sense. And then
mhm,
with grief and loss, obviously, like there's, you know, a
yeah,
lot of particular like points that you can really hone in on as the focus, right? And of course, grief and loss is different if it's a recent loss or if it was a long, long time ago. There's a whole. But I think that provides that provides a boundary around it already. You know, so I would say that's one thing, like thinking about how to pitch it for a specific topic, and then two, I think there is a financial argument to be made, right? That like you're going to end up it's a very much of a bang for your buck kind of idea, right? You're
yeah,
going to end up spending less time in therapy overall.
mhm,
Like, I always tell people that I think a 15-hour intensive is the equivalent of at least 6 months of hourly sessions. And I really do think that's true. Because
wow,
for most
mhm,
people, an hourly session is really a 15-minute session, at least under like American insurance rules.
yeah, mhm,
And the first 10 minutes, how was your week? La la la. When you have a
yeah,
weekly relationship, there's much more of that problem of the week type stuff that comes out.
mhm,
So you're probably spending half of that time, maybe more, not doing EMDR, not doing stage like phase 4. So
mhm,
like maybe in a month of 4 weeks of 50-minute sessions, what's that, 200 minutes? I'm like doing math in my head.
yeah,
Um, you might only be spending 80 of those minutes doing reprocessing, which is less than half. So for like a month's worth of therapy, you're actually getting less than half of the time, right? So if you think about it, probably are getting 6 months worth of work done in a week, 2 weeks, depending on how you structure it. And so one, you're ending up, you're paying more money up front, of course, but you're spending less in the long run. And there's the costs of dealing with something for longer, right? Like, what if you could get through all this in 2 weeks as opposed to over the course of 6 months? How would your life look different if you could feel better in 2 weeks as opposed to, a year from now? Like, what would that mean in terms of your job, your relationships, your stress levels, your whatever, your sleep? But there's like that's a little bit harder to quantify, but there is kind of a financial component to that as well, right? And just like quality of life, And I think I think what I always like to remind people of is like, you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're simply stating the value of it, answering questions they have, and then they can decide for themselves. I've had people be like, oh, I can't afford that. And then a couple months later, they come back and they say, you know what, I think I'm going to do it. So that is their journey. I think we as therapists sometimes can, if we get a no immediately, feel like, oh my God, I overstepped my boundaries. I screwed up. I did this. No, maybe that's just not a no, right? Not a yes right now. And there certainly are people for whom it's not going to be feasible. But I also think it's not up to us to decide that in advance. Like, let's present it to them and they can tell us no. And then you still have the option to be like, okay, well, let's keep doing what we're doing. Like, that doesn't mean you're never going to see them again. You're not going to lose them necessarily if it's not your intention to do that. You're just saying, here's something else that I wanted to let you know that I'm offering.
So my question would be like, so structuring a 15-hour intensive. So just to like refresh, so you're only working on one memory. Or are you working on one cluster?
It's essentially a cluster, I would say. Because it might be like, because for example, I just realized, let me just grab my charger. I just realized my battery is going down really fast. Hold on a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So I really call it a memory cluster. Because I work with a lot of moms for a lot of, I've done a lot of like, pregnancy loss or, the loss of a child, like an infant loss. And that's not just one moment, right? Like there are many pieces of it. That's the theme, but like, I worked with someone who found out that her baby was going to not survive birth. So that was many, many moments within that one experience that we had to process. But it fit really nicely within that RTEP format because they were all very, very, very connected about the same thing. But they were like 10 different moments that, like, the ultrasound where they found out what was wrong with the baby was one. When she had to decide if she was going to, birth the baby or term. Like, there's so many different pieces to it. So it was a memory cluster. Yeah. So that answered that question. That makes sense.
Yeah. We, in like where I got my basic training, when we do our target mapping with clients, we call them clusters, where it's like, maybe like dad's drinking is one cluster, maybe like grandma passing away is like another cluster. And then also things can be like more ambiguous, like it could be more like alcoholism in general, and then like the different targets with that. So like we call them clusters, the way that I was trained.
Yeah. But I mean, like, not to get too into the weeds, but something like dad's alcoholism, there's so many subsets within that even in the context of an intensive, I would say we're not going to deal with all of dad's alcoholism in 15 hours. We're going to pick a couple, like one major.
Okay.
Just because of the time, because even like, you'll just find that even if it's one incident that they settle on, there are going to be these sub strands that even come out of that one incident, And so I just think it's important to be realistic about the time, but I think it's also really cool to see how even when you think your focus is really narrow, it actually ends up having these impacts that are much bigger than you might anticipate,
And is there any like population that you would say intensives are not appropriate for besides the financial side of the intensive?
I mean, I always say that I think you can work intensively with anybody because just working for longer is a useful model. I think you have to be, I think the most important thing for a therapist to decide is how do they want to structure their practice? And then that will dictate who is a good fit for their model and who isn't, right? If you want to do intensive only and no longer and not have any, I'm not saying this is you, but there are people that are like, I only want to do intensives from now on. I pretty much am that way now, except for a few hourly clients that I have. I don't want to have ongoing client relationships anymore. That is so valid. And like I do that mostly. And that's going to dictate who you take on. You're not going to take on someone who has severe attachment disruption, who needs a stable, consistent attachment figure as their therapist. You know, one exception being if they have an ongoing therapist and they want to do an intensive about something specific, right? They're coming to you and then they're going to go back to their therapist. I would say that's one thing. You don't want to take someone who you want to know, like clinically, is this what they need, or do they need, an ongoing weekly therapist? Then that's one thing. I think I always just advise people not to work too far out of their niche because I just think it's beneficial for everybody to have, people that they know. Like for example, I don't do like really severe addiction stuff. Like, sure, I work with a lot of people who have problems with alcohol because it's just such a pervasive thing. But like someone has, severe opioid dependence or something, like that is not my wheelhouse. Like I need to refer that person out. I don't want to do anything that's not going to work for them. I think, I would say it really is about that. Like, what's the population you want to work with? That's the people that you should work with. And I think that anyone can benefit. Like the other thing people say is like, oh, people with dissociation, you shouldn't do intensives with them. I don't agree with that because I have a lot of training in dissociation. Like I work with that a lot. And I think actually those clients benefit a lot from having more.
Yeah. That doesn't make sense that someone, because 15-hour, wouldn't that benefit because you're able to bring that person back?
So.
Yeah.
I think so. Exactly. Because you can bring them back to, but I think that when people hear that, they think, oh, you're going to totally overwhelm this person. You're going to force them to process trauma they're not ready to process. You're going to keep them in it for hours and hours and hours and hours. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're saying like, actually for someone who needs more time and space, this can be a really useful model, but we're not forcing them into anything. You can do like phase 2 resourcing with someone for several hours, and that can be really productive. So if you just think of an intensive as anything longer than like anything outside of the traditional, we meet once a week for an hour, then there's so much scope for making that what you want it to be, So that's what I would say. I think, of course, you have to be careful always clinically about, but I think the same things that you're trying to do still apply. Like the same ways you would keep any client safe still apply in an intensive. But I think it's more about like with intensives, you really have the opportunity to design the practice that you want. So you can take that and say, well, I'm only going to do intensive with this population because that's what I want to do. And then it'll help you come up with a really good pitch for why that's such a good model for these people. Yeah. I think as long as you know what you're doing, you have good, like as long as in your niche, your skills and you continue to like keep yourself up, like educated on whatever applies to your niche. I think an intensive can be beautiful as long as you're co-creating it with the client, right? Which of course we all do. And you're very clear about what your model is, how you think that would work well for them specifically. And then you come up with it together, Yeah. I have a client that I have worked with for 5 years now who has CID, and our model is we meet every couple of weeks for 3 hours. That's what we do. And it works great. And she is someone who does need a long-term, consistent therapeutic relationship, and that I'm happy to do. But we're not working in what some people would consider the only way that you can do therapy. So we've taken this alternative approach that works much better for her. I find it works better for me. Like I get into like a flow state with her much better because we're not just like, oh God, we're like, you're out of here in 5 minutes. Are you safe to go home? So it just takes some of that pressure off of me, off of them. And it just really allows you to relax into what you're doing because you're not, honestly, like anytime I'm in a 15-minute session, I do have one eye on the clock constantly.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
so does the client, and that takes them completely out of their body. Like, how could it not? But
Yeah.
when you take away that time pressure, it allows them to just like sit with what they're doing in a different way.